Hi and welcome to AXSchat. We're delighted to have Stefan Trommel with us today. Stefan works for the International Labour Organization and is responsible for leading a group of businesses looking at how they can improve employment conditions for people with disabilities and how they can be better employers in terms of making the workplace a more disability inclusive place. I'm sure, Stefan, you can explain that better than I can. So welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. We're excited to have you here. Can you tell us a bit about the ILO and of course the part of the organization that you're leading?
Sure. Hi Neil, thanks for having me with you today. The ILO, first thing to say, it's the International Labour Organization, headquartered here in Geneva, from where I'm speaking to you, is the UN agency specialized in the area of employment. And within that big organization, I am leading the disability team. So we're basically trying to promote the employment of people with disabilities, both through specific initiative as well as also throughout the organization. And within the specific part of our work, I coordinate, as you say, the secretariat of the ILO Global Business and Disability Network, which brings together large global companies as well as national business and disability initiatives that try to promote the employment of people with disabilities in the private sector. Also, and that's particularly exciting for us, in developing countries.
Fantastic. And I know it's a bit like herding cats, getting large international organizations sat around the table, working for one, because obviously they're complex organizations, complex sort of ecosystems within their own rights. How do you find it in terms of being able to, are there commonalities between the organizations in terms of things that they are doing, or is that part of the aim of the work that you're doing to try and find some common ground to move things forwards?
Well, I think the common ground that we find is the approach. And I think that these are companies that have been promoting disability inclusion for many years, some more years, some less years. And I think what they would all have in common is, to some extent, is the narrative. Now, it's a narrative which, while respecting legal obligations and all that, it's really a narrative around the business advantages for employing people with disabilities. It's looking for talent, is disability as part of a diverse workforce, and how all that contributes to companies being better, being more competitive, and being more sustainable. I would say that that is the common ground. And of course, some companies are better in one area, some companies are better in another area. They all have challenges to be disability inclusive throughout their global presence, which I think is what we try to help them. They might have good policies in the country where they have the headquarters and a few other countries, but of course, it's much more challenging to also be disability inclusive in countries, for instance, in countries in the global south, where also the environment makes it much more difficult for companies to find people with disabilities that have the right skills to be able to work for them.
Okay, thank you. Deborah, I know you've got a question.
Yes, Stefan, I know that you have 21, I believe it's 20 or 21 multinational brands, global brands. And I definitely would like to, find a way to weave the names into the interview. And the reason why is because I think we should reward these global brands that are including these and really have even gone so far to sign a charter, show their commitment. One thing I would wonder, coming from the United States, I know that you're going to do an event in the United States on June 20th in Washington, D.C. And, it's always interesting dealing with the United States, the government and the corporations in the U.S. because we seem to have this thing with the United Nations. I know the United States, we fund a lot of the UN's, I heard that the United States funds 35% of the UN. And so what are, how could corporations in the United States get more engaged in these conversations? I know that a lot of these corporations are having national conversations, but I really believe we need to be having international conversations. So what would you say if you were talking to United States brands about why they should be part of the ILO's efforts with business conversations with global employers?
Yes, well, I think the benefits for US brands to join up with the global network are similar to the benefits for other brands. No? And we have basically the value proposition of the network has three components. One is access to knowledge. Companies can learn from each other, and sometimes they can also learn from us. Definitely, we have learned a lot from them. Companies can get through the global network have communication benefits. So through, let's say, neutral network, they can find ways through which to present to a global audience what they're doing in the area of disability inclusion. And finally, and that is becoming more and more the added value for global network members, and I think it's particularly relevant also for US companies, we can help global companies to promote disability inclusion throughout their global presence. Now, really to address the challenge that I mentioned before, helping them to promote employment in countries like Egypt, like Zambia, like Ethiopia, like Indonesia, Bangladesh, etc., where perhaps initially it seems more difficult than to do that in the US. So I think these benefits that the network provides are also relevant for US companies. We are trying with this event in DC in June that you mentioned, Deborah, really to bring the network closer to the US. We're trying to find a way of identifying US companies, but basically US companies that have a global presence. Of course, large US companies that have, let's say, a focus mostly on the US market are also more than welcome. But we think that the network is particularly useful for US companies that have a presence outside the US in a number of countries. And the message we also bring to US companies, and we've brought to other global companies, is that companies need to realize that the whole attention to disability has changed significantly over the last 10 years. Thanks to a number of developments, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, the new 2030 Development Agenda, the expectations from the private sector, also in developing countries, in terms of disability inclusion are growing and increasing. More policies are coming up, more legislation, more attention in general. And we think that companies that want to continue to be leaders in their sectors at a global scale need to see and consider disability inclusion as an element of that objective. And it's with that where the network can help them.
And, it's interesting that you say that because I travel often. I'm heading to Sweden. Neil and Antonio are going as well. We're going to be attending the FUNCA conference. And one thing that I find often when I'm traveling to these different countries, and I've traveled, to some of the same events that you've been at, Stefan, but I see these global brands there. I was in the UAE a couple of weeks ago, and I saw Canadian brands and I saw US brands, and yet I'm talking to the people that are on the ground trying to get people with disabilities hired in those locations, and these brands are not hiring them. And I remember when I was in Singapore, and I mean, Singapore, very cosmopolitan, and they have all these global brands, many US brands, UK brands, European brands that I know are employing people with disabilities in the UK, in Europe, in the US, but they're not doing it in Singapore. They're not doing it in Egypt. They're not doing it in, India or China or the other developing countries. And so that's one reason why I really believe in what you're doing, the ILO is doing. And I remember, to me, this intersects with what we've done with ICT accessibility, because in the United States, we had the Section 508. We wanted to make sure that everything was accessible, but we didn't want our government telling the corporations whether or not they were there. So then the Europeans, they have to do it better than us now. The Europeans said, I think that we're not going to let brands, self-certify. They're not, you've done it. And so the United States tried to influence Europe. It's always funny when we try to do that, saying, no, do it like we did it. Because as a brand, we don't want to build one set of copiers in Africa and another set in Asia and another set in Europe and another set in the US. Well, we understand that, but at the same time, we, a lot of water under the bridge. The way the Europeans did it actually was more effective. And the way the UK has done employment, I think, has actually been more effective as well. So I think that's another reason we are one world. And so how can you be, even if you're a national brand, you want to be seen as a global best practice. And if you're not part of a global conversation, I'm not sure how you can do that. I'm going to turn the floor over to Antonio.
Thank you, Deborah. One of the things that sometimes we struggle is to have good data from different countries to are able to give us a good idea in terms of the numbers of people with disabilities that are employed. Sometimes you look to some countries and you realize that the last time they collected data was 5 years ago. And it's extremely difficult to have a picture about what is actually happening in and to be able to compare it. So what I would like to ask them is, what initiatives are doing in order to trying to help or for them to collect data on a regular basis, because that would allow us to, if we are trying to create a framework in a period of 10 years, if we have good data, we are in a better position to strategize and to do a better work.
Sure. I mean, the issue of employment data is a big priority in general for the ILO, because I mean that's we have a very big statistics department, and since a number of years we've also been working on the issue of having better employment statistics of people with disabilities. It's a big challenge, and I think now we have an additional incentive to become better, because the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development makes a very strong push for better statistics on a number of fronts. They even speak about a data revolution. And one of the groups for which a number of the goals need to provide information are people with disabilities, and including in the area of employment. So right now that is leading us here in the ILO, and we're working on that with other organizations to design tools that can better capture the employment of people with disabilities in regular labor force surveys. We need to have much better information, and it is still a bit challenge. And employment statistics on people with disabilities is a general challenge, and you come across very different percentages, for instance, of people with disabilities in countries, and without no real reason for that. It's just very different definitions sometimes of who is disabled or not. So you have countries speaking about 20%, countries speaking about 2%. So we're finding ways to harmonize that a bit more, to have more comparable data. And within that overall approach, the ILO is working to ensure that there are also much better employment data of people with disabilities.
Stefan, will you tell us what companies are involved? And Antonio, I'm sorry, we can do a follow. I didn't mean to accidentally step on you. If you want to follow up, and then I can ask that question.
Okay. So according to the information that was in your site, we have there's an estimate of 1 billion, or 15% of the world population, and 80% of them are in the working age. We know that in Europe, unions have some levels of importance according to the countries, sort of Europe or Germany. Can you tell us what type of engagement you have with the unions, and how they relate within the space of your organization when it concerns the right of people with disabilities?
Yes, the ILO, one of the specific characteristics of the ILO is that we are what we call a tripartite organization. I mean, our governing structure does not only include the governments through their ministries of labor and equivalent, but also the employer federations and the trade unions. And that tries to reflect the strong belief in the ILO that initiatives in the area of employment and labor market needs to promote it through this, what we call social dialogue of all the parts. And the more that any measure can be supported by both by employers, employer federations, trade unions, as well as government, the more effective these measures will be. This means that definitely we work, but it's fair to say, I think also that trade unions have not paid as much attention to the issue of disability than one would have hoped. It's starting slowly to change. We organized, for instance, a meeting in December with trade unions from the public service sector, a very strategic sector from our point of view. There's a new meeting which is being held in May, again, bringing together national trade unions that are working on disability issues. And we did a mapping exercise of that last year. We found a number of good examples of trade unions working on disability, but we would still say that the attention within the trade union movement to the issue of people with disabilities needs to be increased significantly. It's not at the level that we would think convenient. And I think it's even fair to say that there's often more attention on disability issues by employers, sometimes by employer federations, than by specific trade unions.
Just to follow up that, just very quickly. So when you are organizing those events, and particularly with some focus in Europe, when you go and see the list of participants, is there a particular country that is usually absent from that type of engagement, or it can vary?
You mean in terms of trade unions, or in general in terms of companies?
In terms of trade unions.
I wouldn't say so. I think in general, what we feel is there needs in general to be more involvement from the trade union side. I think there are a number of national trade unions from the UK, Ireland, a bit of Netherlands. I'm trying not to remember the meeting we had in December. No, a bit from Spain, France, yes. But in general, it is not a huge interest on the side of trade unions. As I said, there are specific trade unions from specific countries that are doing some interesting work on disability, but in general, it's a rather low level of attention to the issue.
Okay, thank you. Back to you, Deborah.
Thank you, and sorry about that earlier, Antonio. I would be. I know our listeners would be interested to know who are the ILO, what global companies are part of the ILO, and also could you talk just a little bit about the charter that they've signed and just explain to our viewers about the charter? And then I'm going to turn the floor over to Neil after you answer the question because he has a comment to make.
Sure. I'm not sure whether I would be able to remember by heart right now the 21 companies that joined. I can give a few names, but I'm a bit afraid that I would leave out some of them, and that wouldn't be fair. But let me address the issue of the charter. The charter, in fact, was a proposal coming from from the steering committee of the network. We had thought about that before, also as secretariat. We were a bit concerned to come up with a tool that could lead to create a barrier for companies to join the network, especially companies that are starting the journey of disability inclusion. But then the steering committee members said, look, it will give more credibility to the network that we have a charter which establishes a certain level of commitment by charter members that sign up to the network. So right now it's become the requirement. Companies that want to become a network member needs to sign the charter. We make a bit of publicity around it. We do that at 1 or 2 annual events, so that we sort of have some PR around that. We try that the charter is signed by the CEO of the company. It's very important that there's a top level commitment reflected in the signing of the charter. The charter covers 10 different areas, so there's basically 10 principles. We drafted them in a very aspirational way, but it tries to reflect which are the different areas in which we think that companies should think about when promoting disability inclusion. And the very important element also of the charter is it is a commitment on the side of global companies really to promote disability inclusion globally. We know it's a challenge, but this is the main commitment that I see that we think companies are making. They commit themselves as much as possible to promote disability inclusion throughout their global presence. And we speak about companies that have branches and subsidiaries in 40 countries, 60 countries, 80 countries, some of them. We are speaking about very large companies. The combined workforce of these 21 companies is close to 4 million employees. We're currently just trying to get the latest data, but it's a very big size what we're talking about. Some companies, the largest, have 400,000 and something employees. We have companies from very different sectors. We have IBM, we have Dow, we have Michelin, the tire. We have Telenor from the phone company from Norway. We have Sodexo, very large company in the service sector. We have 4 banks: Standard Bank, Standard Chartered Bank, Société Générale, and BNP Paribas. We have 2 big retail companies, Group Casinos, very strong presence also not only in France but also in Colombia and Brazil. The French-based Carrefour Group, again a very big retail company. We have Accenture, we have Adecco, AXA, and the insurance companies. We have Accor Hotels, and we have Adecco, the big human resource company. And I'm leaving out a few, which I apologize for that, but I think it's a big group of companies, very strong presence. We just have done a mapping of the countries in which they have a presence, which will help us also to strengthen the national initiatives and promote national initiatives where they don't exist yet. So I think it's a very good network from which you draw. We have a couple of companies that will join in the coming 2 months, and we also expect, of course, to have new members joining us thanks to the events we are organizing this year, in particular the one in the US, but we're also organizing an event in South Africa end of July, where we also hope to get some more companies that have a strong presence in the African continent.
And sorry to put you on the spot. 21 companies is hard to remember off the top of your head. So Neil?
Yeah, no, thank you. And just out of interest for our audience, I think that you're not expecting these organizations to commit to huge sums of money here. From my understanding, it's these are large companies. The expectation is more around knowledge sharing and everything else, because quite often what we see is that there are multiple initiatives asking for the same pots of money, and although large companies often have significant turnover, the budgets for the departments that are dealing with disability, diversity, inclusion aren't necessarily as well funded as maybe the sales team is. So my understanding is that you're a very reasonable and affordable initiative.
That's true. That's true. I mean, we have a membership fee which was agreed with our members. It's $10,000 per year. It still requires a decision in the company. I think it has generated a healthy accountability relationship. I mean, at the very beginning, and that's normal with any network that you start like this, there were more voluntary contributions. So some were making contributions, others were not, and that was good at the beginning. But then we said, well, this is not fair for those that make contributions. We should. Every company should make a contribution. As we're talking about very large companies, it didn't make sense to come up with a scale. I mean, because $10,000 is for these companies is not a big thing, but it requires a decision, and I think it requires also that we on our side need to be able to deliver. Somebody will ask our contact people in those companies, is this money well used? Is there a return on this investment? And I think it has generated a healthy relationship for companies. And let me add 4 more that I'm thinking of. I think I now have all of them except probably 1 or 2. Orange, for instance, the big French phone company, is another member. Novartis, chemical company. Engie, a big French-owned or French-based engineering company, and Repsol, the Spanish oil company. It just also, I think, it shows nicely the different sectors that are part of the network, which also gives us a good breadth of approaches. And I think it also shows that people with disabilities can be employed in any sector. And very often one gets these messages in terms of there are certain sectors that seem to be more amenable to employment of people with disabilities, but I think we would say that there are jobs for people with disabilities in all sectors. And I think the composition of our network shows that also.
So I have a comment and stroke question going back to your earlier comment about the Global South, and the difficulty that you have in finding qualified candidates. So I understand this issue. Again, working for a global company, there is a need to develop the skill base of people with disabilities. Is that a role that ILO sees itself playing a part in? And would it be working with other UN agencies to help facilitate that education and upskilling of people with disabilities? And what other players do you see having to play a role in this to enable people with disabilities to get to the starting gate effectively? Because at the moment, many people aren't.
Yes, a very good point. I just come back from Morocco this morning, and we had a meeting yesterday on how to promote the employment of people with disabilities in the private sector. Very large meeting, presence of 2 ministers, good media coverage, well attended. Not as many companies as we would have liked, but a good number of organizations doing job matching, promotion, and all that, and a good presence of different ministries. In particular, also the public employment services in Morocco and the organization in charge of vocational training in Morocco. And I think it was important to have them there because it reinforces also our messages, which is basically the mainstream vocational training system is not delivering at this stage in an adequate way for people with disabilities. What you find in most of these countries is still that people with disabilities are excluded from education. That's the first problem, but also from vocational training. And very often they are sent to specialized, segregated vocational training institutions, which provide a very limited range of choices in terms of skills and qualifications. And of course, with no expectation or almost no expectation for these people then to find a job, and definitely not a job in the private market. So it's basically more about self-employment in very low level type of qualifications. So I think that needs to change. Again, the message yesterday in Morocco was very similar. Companies they have a good network of companies in Morocco, Moroccan companies, as well as branches of global companies, some of those like members with us. It's a network hosted by the Moroccan Employer Federation, doing interesting work, also as a wider CSR initiative. But the main message is it's very difficult for us to find people with disabilities with the right skills. And it's not impossible, they are there, but the pool of candidates is very limited. And I think there are structural changes that need to happen. Education is an issue, of course. But at the same time, my message also at the meeting was there are things that companies can already do. And one of the things we are suggesting, companies should get engaged perhaps in collaboration with vocational training providers. The issue of apprenticeship schemes has a huge potential and is in general portrayed as one of the big global solutions or contribution to a solution of combating youth unemployment. And what we need to ensure on our side is that these solutions, these mainstream solutions, are inclusive of people with disabilities. The ILO has a role in that. We have a general role in helping countries to improve their skills development systems. And we're now trying to ensure that our colleagues who do that and who are experts on that take into account, include people with disabilities in that, also in apprenticeship schemes. The main role, but the main responsibility of that, I mean, the ILO can help in that, but of course, at the end of the day, the main responsibility for that, and that we made it also very clear yesterday, is of national governments. It's national governments that have the main responsibility of providing education and vocational training to their citizens. And unfortunately, they tend to very often forget people with disabilities, and that puts them in a very difficult situation, not only to find a job already, but even more to find decent work, which is also very much what we're trying to promote. It's not just about getting a job, it's also about getting a job and having the same career development opportunities as the rest of the population. And currently, companies are starting to express their interest. still much more to be done on that front. But in parallel, we need to work on the other side of the equation, because if companies don't have enough pools of candidates from which to draw, then the figures will remain very low.
And I think that's a really good point. It just shows that no problem. And one thing that I like about what the ILO is doing, I've watched multiple videos that you and your done that you've posted out on YouTube. And they're very powerful videos that I've actually used in presentations when I'm talking to corporations to say, look at the brands here and what they're doing and how they're talking about it. It's very empowering messages. And I also find that often when I'm traveling to different countries, and I know all of us are doing this, but the employers are not in the room. Often the employers are not in the room in these conferences that I'm attending. And decisions are being made that impact these employers. And so I also think it's important to note that what you're doing at the ILO is you're looking at this from a global perspective, which is very important, but you're encouraging these large corporations to also look at it from a national perspective, get involved with the organizations nationally. You've got, these, and one thing we will do, and I apologize for putting you on the spot, making you remember 21 companies, but we will add that to AXSchat.com. We will put a note out there of all of the companies, and we'll also put some links, not only to how you can find out more about your group, but also to the YouTube mentioning as well. But I also know you do different conferences where you bring all of these players together and you bring in speakers for them, and you really encourage them to talk about their best practices and what they're doing and share ideas with each other. It's a very, very important group, and that's one reason why I bugged you so long to get on the program. But I just think it's very important that we have these conversations from a global perspective. And one more comment I'm going to make. Been very involved in other parts of the United Nations, where I know the Global Compact, another part of the United Nations, is putting together a manual for businesses, and you were very involved with that, and you brought in some of your partners and your members. And so being part of this global conversation, it is not just limited to just ILO, but it actually expands out into other parts of the United Nations as well, and ties into what we're trying to do as a world with the SDG goals as well, which very important goals to me personally. So I just was wondering if maybe you wanted to comment.
Sure. I mean, I think the first thing I would say to that is that what led us to promote the network, and what leads us to promote these national networks, is really the need for this employer-driven issues. I mean, what I've learned in the too many years I'm working in this field is that the best way to convince an employer about the benefits of employing people with disabilities is when they listen to another employer who has done so, who can share how they did it, why they did it, and how it worked out, and the positive impact it had. That is what opens the eyes and the ears of fellow employers. If I say those same things as wearing the ILO hat or the head of a ministry or an NGO, it does not have that same impact. No? So from that point of view, we see ourselves really very much as a facilitator of these peer-to-peer dialogues. We are happy to have in those dialogues also NGOs that know how private sector works and that can be effective partners of companies. We always recommend, and we had some good examples yesterday in Morocco, of companies that are effective partners, NGOs that are effective partners of companies and can help them, for instance, find the right people, give them a bit of support in terms of disability awareness, working out a bit how the support that and the support that companies will require. So that's very important. But we really are very strong about ensuring this, I would call it a safe space for companies to share with each other what worked, what didn't work, and that they can sort of support each other in that. So that's very important. And to have that at global level is important, but even more important is to have that at the level of the country, in Egypt, in Zambia, in the context of, I mean, how do you deal with those issues in Egypt? And while you can always learn from what happens in other countries, you also need to come with the country-specific solution. I mean, which are the country-specific partners? Which are the mechanisms? How? What's the legal framework? What are the incentives or the non-incentives? All these issues are country-specific, and I think it's very important to have these what we call national business and disability networks, where companies come together, local companies as well as branches of global companies, to help each other to move the agenda forward. That's the first thing. The second thing, you mentioned Global Compact. Yes, we are at the final stages of launching a guide for business. We call them On the Rights of People with Disabilities. It will be a joint product between the UN Global Compact and the ILO. And well, we have been able to involve a number of experts like yourself, Deborah, and hopefully we were coming up with a product that will be interesting for companies. I mean, the target group are companies. It approaches, of course, the employment angle, which is our focus as ILO, but it also covers the complementary angle in terms of the benefits for companies to address consumers with disabilities, and how companies that employ people with disabilities are also better prepared to respond to the diverse needs of consumers with disabilities, and how these two elements sort of help each other.
So when we in European terms, there are still a few countries where networks of companies for people with disabilities don't exist. So they could be very active in UK, where the UK Disability Network, but in some European countries there is not such a thing as a disability network for where companies organize and talk about this. What type? If there are companies who have this type of interest, can they expect any support from your organization in order to help them to build those networks?
Yes, I mean, the ILO, as many other UN agencies, we have a stronger focus on developing countries. I mean, we know that there are many challenges also in terms of employment of people with disabilities in EU countries and other OECD countries, but our main target group in terms of countries are developing countries. And definitely in developing countries, we support the establishment of these national networks. We help them by providing, let's say, technical assistance, by giving them a bit of guidance on how other networks were established, promoting sort of peer-to-peer support also between networks. We help them by convincing the global companies that have a presence in that country to be part of the initial group of companies that come together to create such a network. And of course, we help them by sort of linking them up with the global network, and then be able to sort of, on one hand, benefit from the products and tools that the global network is producing, but also to for these national networks to be able to present what they're doing to a global audience. And so it's not a very intensive support that we can provide, but it's also not. I mean, at the end of the day, it's not huge resources that are required to establish such a network. What is very important is what's always a challenge is to have one organization a bit being the driving force of reaching out to these companies, convening them, bringing them together. This is sometimes the role of local offices of the ILO, where we have a good presence. This has happened in a number of Latin American countries. In other contexts, it is the employer federation that is, for instance, Morocco, as I mentioned, they have this disability working group as part of the Moroccan Employer Federation, which is a good employer federation. So that's another alternative. And we also, for instance, we're organizing a meeting here in May with large disability and development organizations that have a strong presence in many developing countries, are starting to work much more with the private sector, and they are also well placed to help with the establishment, but also with the strengthening of these national business and disability initiatives. No? As I said, it's more, that could also apply to EU countries. The problem we have is that we have, let's say, a more of an inclination to be more actively present in developing countries.
Now, just taking into your words in relation to developing countries, one of the issues that we have in Europe over the last couple of years is the fact that we have a good number of refugees coming to Europe, and amongst those who have people with disabilities. You have hosted a few meetings that focus on that. Can you tell us what is your intervention in the area of refugees in Europe?
In terms of disability, it's a new topic. I mean, the ILO, as in general, has started, especially now with the refugee crisis, to have a bit more presence, for instance, in the context of Syrian refugees. Very interesting now, the ILO has just signed a new memorandum of understanding with the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, which, as you know, is the main UN agency responsible for refugees. And this joint agreement between the UNHCR and the ILO has a strong focus on the issue of livelihoods, of employment of refugees. What we all know is that the refugee situation is no longer only an emergency situation. There are emergency issues, but then unfortunately many people will continue to be in a refugee status for many years. And that's where then, of course, employment issues come in, complex as they are, because not many host countries have the most enabling environment for refugees to find a job in those that is starting to change. And thanks to this new agreement between the UNHCR and the ILO, the disability focal points in both agencies, we've also come together to try to ensure that within that collaboration that is starting and is increasing, we also pay attention to the issue of refugees with disabilities. But it's an absolutely new development. It has just happened almost like in the last month. So I mean, I can only say we are starting to look into that, but it is a new topic, triggered in particular with the latest refugee crisis.
Thank you very much. I know that we've slightly overstepped our half an hour, but it's been well worth it. So, and I just wanted to comment about the peer-to-peer stuff before we finally close. I know from working with Business Disability Forum, what you're saying is absolutely true, that people want Chatham House rules because then they feel comfortable to be able to share their weaknesses as well as the things that they're doing right. And that's really important for the peer-to-peer learning, that people are able to feel comfortable and empowered enough to express not only the good things, but the areas where they feel they can do better, because that's where we really learn. So thank you for reinforcing that message. Thank you for the work you're doing, and we really look forward to you joining us on Twitter for our chat. Thank you very much, Stefan.
Thanks to you. Thanks to you.
Thank you.